On July 7, 2026, something changed on European roads. Most people probably didn't even notice that it happened. But from that day forward, every newly registered passenger car and van sold in European Union is now required to include an AI-based system designed to monitor whether the driver is paying attention to the road. It is called Advanced Driver Distraction Warning, or ADDW, and it became mandatory as part of the latest phase of the European Union's General Safety Regulation. If you've read headlines saying that the EU now requires cars to watch your face, that's only part of the story. Because this isn't just about a camera, it's about a much bigger shift in the relationship between humans and machines. For over a century, cars have been nothing more than machines that responded to our commands. We pressed the accelerator and they accelerated. We turned the wheel and they turned. If something went wrong, the assumption was the driver made a mistake. But today's cars, they are different. They are beginning to make judgments, and not just about the road, but about us, whether we are paying attention or if we are distracted, whether we are too tired to continue driving, or even if we are capable of safely controlling the vehicle. And for the first time in automotive history, the car isn't only observing the environment around it, it's observing the person behind the wheel. And that raises an interesting question. When did a car stop being just a machine and start becoming an observer? To answer that, we need to understand exactly what happened on July 7th, because despite some dramatic headlines, the European Union did not suddenly decide to install cameras in every existing car. If you already own a car, nothing changes. The regulation only applies to newly registered new passenger cars and vans entering the European market. From that date onward, older vehicles do not need to be retrofitted, and owners are under no obligation to modify their current cars. In reality, this law is the final step of a process that began years ago, giving manufacturers time to gradually introduce the required technologies. The systems first became mandatory for newly approved vehicle models in 2024. Now, they apply to virtually every vehicle registered across the European Union. And the camera isn't the only requirement. The same phase of the regulation also requires advanced emergency braking systems capable of detecting pedestrians and cyclists, improved forward visibility for drivers, new standards for tire performance as they wear, and expanded areas of safety glass intended to reduce injuries to pedestrians during collisions. All of these measures are part of the European Commission's long-term Vision Zero strategy, an ambitious plan to reduce road deaths as close to zero as possible by 2050. When you hear that goal, it's difficult to argue against it. Every year, thousands of people across Europe lose their lives in road accidents. Many more suffer life-changing injuries. A large proportion of those crashes are linked to human error, distraction, fatigue, speeding, poor judgment, and delayed reactions. If technology can reduce even a fraction of those accidents, shouldn't we welcome it? That is precisely the argument behind these regulations. The logic is straightforward. Humans make mistakes, and machines don't get sleepy. They don't check text messages, and they don't lose concentration after a stressful day. So if artificial intelligence can notice that a driver has looked at their phone for several seconds or is beginning to fall asleep, perhaps it can warn them before the tragedy occurs. On paper, that sounds difficult to oppose, but this story didn't begin in 2026. In fact, it didn't even begin with artificial intelligence. To understand why modern cars are beginning to monitor drivers, we have to go back almost 50 years ago, because this has been happening slowly. The first major turning point came in 1978, when Mercedes-Benz introduced the first production anti-lock braking systems, better known as ABS, developed together with Bosch. Today, ABS feels so ordinary that it's hard to imagine driving without it. But at the time, the idea was revolutionary. Imagine driving on a wet road and you suddenly see an obstacle. Instinctively, you're gonna slam on the brakes. Without ABS, the wheels can lock completely. Once that happens, the tires stop rolling and begin sliding across the road. You may still be pressing the brake pedal, with all your strength, but you have lost something even more important than braking performance. You've lost steering. A sliding tire has very little ability to change direction. Instead of steering around the obstacle, the car continues almost straight ahead, carried by its momentum. ABS solved this problem by doing something no human could do. Instead of keeping the brakes fully applied, the system rapidly released and reapplied brake pressure many times every second. It continuously measured the rotational speed of each wheel, searching for the instant before a wheel locked. By keeping every wheel rotating just enough to maintain grip, the driver could brake hard while still steering around danger. Notice something important. The system wasn't driving the car. It wasn't making decisions for you. It simply prevented one very specific human mistake. That distinction matters. ABS represented the first step in a philosophy that would eventually transform the automobile. The computer was no longer just running the engine. It was beginning to intervene. The next step came with traction control. If ABS prevents the wheels from locking during braking, traction control prevents them from spinning uncontrollably during acceleration. Imagine trying to pull away from a traffic light on an icy winter morning. You press the accelerator, and instead of moving forward efficiently, one wheel spins wildly while the car struggles for grip. Traction control constantly compares wheel speeds. If one wheel suddenly begins spinning much faster than the others, the system interprets this as a loss of traction. Within milliseconds, it can reduce engine power, apply braking to the slipping wheel, or both, allowing the tires to regain grip. Again, the philosophy remained the same. The car wasn't taking control. It was quietly correcting a mistake before it became dangerous. Then came one of the greatest breakthroughs in vehicle safety: electronic stability control. Many safety experts consider ESC to be one of the most important advances since the invention of the seatbelt. The idea is remarkably sophisticated. The car doesn't simply monitor wheel speed anymore. It also measures steering angle, sideways acceleration, rotational movement around the vehicle center, braking forces, and vehicle direction. In other words, it constantly compares two different realities: where the driver intends the car to go and where the car is actually going. Imagine entering a bend too quickly. You turn the steering wheel, expecting the car to follow the curve. Instead, the tires begin to slide outward. Within fractions of a second, the computer detects the difference between the intended path and the vehicle's actual movement. Before many drivers even realize they've lost control, it selectively brakes individual wheels and adjusts engine power to stabilize the vehicle. Thousands of crashes have been prevented because of this technology. Notice the pattern. ABS corrected braking, traction control corrected acceleration, electronic stability control corrected the loss of control. Every new generation of technology reduced another category of human error. Then something changed. Engineers started asking a different question. Instead of correcting the car, what if we corrected the driver? Adaptive cruise control was one of the first systems to hint at this transition. Unlike traditional cruise control, which simply maintains a chosen speed, adaptive systems use radar, cameras, and increasingly AI-powered perception to measure the distance to vehicles ahead. If traffic slows, the car slows. If traffic speeds up, the car accelerates again. Suddenly, the vehicle wasn't only responding to your commands, it was observing traffic and making continuous decisions. Lane keeping assistance pushed that idea even further. Using cameras to read road markings, the car could detect when it was drifting out of his lane without signaling. If necessary, it gently steered the vehicle toward the center. Again, the goal wasn't to replace the driver, it was to catch moments of inattention before they became accidents. But these systems revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even the smartest assistance systems have one major weakness. They can see the road, but it can't always understand the person driving. A perfectly functioning lane keeping system can't tell whether you're looking at your phone. Adaptive cruise control doesn't know if you're falling asleep. Emergency braking can predict that you are about to lose consciousness. The vehicle became increasingly intelligent, but the driver remained the biggest unknown variable. And that realization fundamentally changed the direction of automotive engineering. For decades, engineers had focused on building cars that understood the world outside the windshield. Now they began trying to understand the world inside the cabin. The question was no longer what's happening on the road, it became what's happening to the person driving. And that shift marks one of the biggest philosophical changes in the history of automobile. Cars no longer exist only to help us control the machine. Increasingly, they are designed to monitor whether we are still capable of controlling ourselves. So how can a car possibly know whether you are paying attention? After all, it can't read your thoughts. It doesn't know whether you are thinking about dinner, worrying about work, or just simply daydreaming. The truth is, it doesn't have to. Modern driving monitor systems don't try to understand what you are thinking. They try to understand what you are doing. More specifically, they look for tiny physical clues that reveal where your attention probably is. The remarkable thing is that none of these clues are particularly useful on their own. Looking down isn't suspicious. Blinking is not suspicious. Turning your head is not suspicious. Even taking one hand off the steering wheel, it's fine. We all do these things while driving. We glance at the speedometer, we adjust the air conditioning, or just changing the radio. And sometimes we take a sip of water and we scratch our nose. If the car reacted every time you looked away from the road, it would be completely unusable. But instead, modern AI tries to answer a much more difficult question. Is the driver's behavior consistent with someone who is safely controlling the vehicle? And that may sound like a small difference, but in reality is the entire challenge. To answer that question, the vehicle begins collecting information from several different sources at the same time. The first and most obvious one is the camera. Unlike a normal dashboard camera, the driver monitoring camera isn't looking through the windshield. It's looking directly at you. Most manufacturers place it either above the steering wheel, behind the steering wheel itself, or integrated into the instrument cluster where it has a clear view of the driver's face. But here's something that surprises many people. The camera usually isn't recording the kind of colorful image you are imagining. Instead, many systems use infrared light. Infrared is part of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes can't see, but camera sensors can. Small infrared LEDs constantly illuminated the driver's face without producing any visible light. And that means the system can work just as well in complete darkness as it does on a sunny afternoon. Whether you are driving at midday or 3 o'clock in the morning, the camera still sees your eyes. So why not just use a normal camera? Because normal cameras struggle when lighting changes. Imagine driving through a tunnel and 1 second your face is brightly illuminated by sunlight, but the next it's almost completely dark. Then you emerge back into bright daylight. To a conventional camera, these sudden changes make accurate tracking much more difficult. Infrared largely removes that problem. Since the system provides its own invisible source of illumination, it doesn't depend nearly as much on the outside environment. That makes it far more reliable, especially during night driving, the very time when fatigue-related accidents are most common. But seeing your face isn't enough. The camera doesn't actually care what you look like. It isn't interested in whether you have blue eyes, brown eyes, a beard, sunglasses, or freckles, whatever. What it really wants are measurements. Every fraction of a second, artificial intelligence identifies dozens and sometimes hundreds of reference points across your face. The corners of your eyes, the edges of your eyelids, your eyebrows, the bridge of your nose, the corners of your mouth, the outline of your jaw. These are known as facial landmarks, and together they create a constantly updating three-dimensional map of your face. Think of it like connecting dots. One dot means almost nothing. 100 dots, well, they begin to reveal a pattern. And once the system knows exactly where these landmarks are, it can calculate something even more important. Where are your eyes actually looking? This process is called gaze estimation, and despite sounding futuristic, it's based on geometry. The computer knows the position of the camera. It knows the orientation of your head, it knows where your pupils are relative to your eyelids, and by combining those measurements, it estimates the direction of your gaze. And notice that I said estimates. The system doesn't know with absolute certainty where you are looking. Instead, it calculates the most probable direction. And that's a very important distinction. Many headlines claim that cars know exactly where your eyes are, but in reality, they make extremely sophisticated probability calculations based on the information available. Then comes perhaps the cleverest part. The AI doesn't simply ask, did the driver look away? Instead, it asks if looking away actually makes sense. So imagine you are driving on a motorway and you're preparing to overtake another vehicle. You activate the left indicator and your eyes move toward the left mirror and your head turns slightly, but a second later you check the road ahead again, and then you change lanes, and to a human observer that behavior is perfectly normal, and the AI reaches exactly the same conclusion. Every action supports the others. The indicator explains why you looked left, the mirror check explains the head movement, and the lane change explains the sequence. Nothing unusual has happened. But now imagine a different situation. You are driving straight on an empty road, and there's no junction, no lane change, and no traffic. But your head tilts downward and your eyes remain fixed below the dashboard. And 3, 4, even 5 seconds pass. The steering wheel receives only tiny corrections and the vehicle begins drifting slightly within its lane. Now, the same downward gaze tells a completely different story. Not because looking down is forbidden, but the context has changed. This idea, understanding context rather than individual actions, is one of the biggest differences between traditional software and modern artificial intelligence. Older systems relied mostly on fixed rules. If X happened, do Y. But modern AI tries to interpret behavior as a whole. And to do that, the camera alone is not enough. While the camera watches the driver, dozens of other sensors are quietly monitoring the vehicle itself. The steering wheel reports every tiny correction you make. Wheel speed sensors measure how each tire rotates. The lane keeping camera tracks your position on the road, and the turn indicators reveal your intentions, and the vehicle knows its speed, its acceleration, its braking, sometimes even the weather conditions through range sensors. Individually, none of this information says very much, but together they begin to tell a story. Imagine trying to understand a football match by watching only the goalkeeper. You would miss almost everything. But now if you imagine seeing all 22 players at once, suddenly the game makes sense. So modern driver monitoring works in much the same way. Engineers call this sensor fusion. Instead of trusting one camera or one sensor, the computer combines information from many independent sources, constantly comparing them against one another. Your eyes say you are looking left. Your indicator says you are about to change lanes. Your steering wheel begins moving left. The lane camera confirms the maneuver, and you see where this is going, right? Everything agrees. The system becomes more confident that your behavior is normal. But if your eyes are closed and your head slowly drops and the steering wheel becomes almost perfectly still, the vehicle starts drifting and there is no indication that you intended any of it. The confidence shifts in the opposite direction. No single sensor concludes that you are falling asleep. It's the combination that matters. In many ways, the artificial intelligence isn't acting like a security camera. It's acting more like a detective. Every sensor provides a clue, and one clue proves nothing, but 10 clues pointing toward the same conclusion become much harder to ignore. And that's perhaps the most fascinating part of all. These systems aren't simply watching what the drivers do anymore. They are trying to infer something much deeper. It's not just our actions, but our attention. At this point, you might be wondering something. If these systems are so sophisticated, why were they introduced in the first place? Was this simply another opportunity for car manufacturers to sell more technology? Or was it governments becoming obsessed with surveillance? Or was there actually a problem serious enough to justify placing a camera inside every new car? And to answer that, we have to look at something surprisingly uncomfortable. For decades, engineers believed that making safer cars meant making better machines. You have stronger brakes and stronger seat belts, more airbags and a stronger passenger compartment. You get better tires and better suspension. And those improvements worked. Modern cars are dramatically safer than they were 40 years ago. A collision that might have been fatal in the 1980s is often survivable today, and it's because the vehicle itself has become incredibly good at protecting its occupants. But then something unexpected happened. As the machines kept getting better, the people didn't. Road death certainly declined over the years, but eventually engineers noticed something frustrating. Many of the crashes that still occurred weren't happening because the car had failed. They happened because the human behind the wheel had. And that's a much more difficult problem to solve. You can redesign a braking system, but you can't redesign human nature. Or can you? If you look at road accident investigators around the world, one phrase appears over and over again: human error. It's an incredibly broad term. Sometimes it means speeding, sometimes driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs, sometimes misjudging another driver's speed, and sometimes it's simply making the wrong decision under pressure. But perhaps the most frustrating category of all is the one that should be entirely preventable: distraction. Imagine driving along a familiar road and nothing unusual is happening. The journey has become a routine. Your brain begins to relax, and out of nowhere, you hear your phone vibrate. And you think, well, it's just one quick glance. And then you look down, and maybe you are checking a message or just changing a song. Maybe you are reading a notification that, takes only 2-3 seconds. And that doesn't feel dangerous because, after all, 2 seconds isn't very long. But at 100 kilometers an hour, 2 seconds is enough to travel more than 50 meters. And that's roughly half the length of a football field, blind. And it's not because your eyes were closed, but because they were looking somewhere else. And this is one of the reasons mobile phones transformed road safety in ways that nobody anticipated. When the first smartphones appeared, they weren't seen as a traffic safety issue. They were communication devices, and then navigation systems, and then music players, and then cameras, and then social media. And today they are all of those things at once. Every notification competes for your attention, and every vibration asks a question. Every screen promises that whatever is happening inside it might be more important than what is happening outside your windshield. And unlike many traditional distractions, smartphones are interactive. Changing a radio station might take a second, but reading a conversation or replying to a message, those actions demand something much more valuable than your eyes. They demand your brain. Researchers often divide distraction into 3 categories. The first is visual distraction. Your eyes leave the road. The second is manual distraction, when one or both hands leave the steering wheel. But perhaps the most dangerous is cognitive distraction, when your mind leaves the task of driving. Because here's something many people don't realize: you can be looking directly through the windshield and still fail to see what is in front of you. Psychologists call this inattentional blindness. The eyes continue receiving information, but the brain, occupied by something else, simply doesn't process it. Most of us have experienced this. If someone asks you if you saw the cyclist and your honest answer is no, it's not because the cyclist wasn't there, but your attention was somewhere else. And that distinction is incredibly important. Safe driving isn't just about seeing, it's about noticing. And that brings us to another problem that has existed far longer than smartphones, which is fatigue. And unlike alcohol, fatigue is difficult to recognize in yourself. Very few people consciously decide that they are too tired to drive, and instead, tiredness creeps in gradually. your reaction time slows by tiny amounts, your blinking becomes slightly longer, and your steering corrections become less frequent. You stop scanning your mirrors as often, and your thoughts begin wandering. Then something even stranger happens. Your brain starts convincing you that you are still capable. And this phenomenon is one reason fatigue is so dangerous. The very condition that reduces your ability to judge your own alertness also reduces your ability to recognize that you are no longer alert. So, in other words, being tired makes you worse at realizing that you are tired. Eventually, some drivers experience what are known as micro sleeps. And these are involuntary episodes of sleep that may last only a fraction of a second or several seconds. And the frightening part is that many people never realize they happened. Imagine driving at motorway speed and your eyes close just for 3 seconds. The car continues moving exactly as before and there is no sudden braking. But in those 3 seconds, you have traveled nearly 100 meters without consciously controlling the vehicle. And by the time you wake, the accident may already have begun. From the perspective of engineers and road safety experts, this creates an almost impossible challenge. The driver doesn't intend to crash. The vehicle doesn't have a mechanical failure, but instead the driver's own brain quietly stops doing its job. So the question became inevitable. If modern cars can detect when a tire is losing pressure, then why shouldn't they detect when a driver is losing concentration? And that simple idea became the foundation for an entirely new generation of safety systems. And it's not because engineers believed that humans were bad drivers, but they understood something psychologists knew for a long time. Human attention is remarkably fragile. We are easily distracted and we become mentally overloaded and we grow tired. We overestimate our own abilities. And in fact, one of the greatest paradoxes of driving is that the more experienced we become, the less consciously we think about it. Actions that once required complete concentration become automatic, and that's usually a good thing until something unexpected happens. And that is exactly what the European Union hopes to reduce. The new regulations aren't based on the belief that technology can eliminate every accident. They are based on a much narrower and perhaps a more realistic idea. If artificial intelligence can recognize the early warning signs that humans often miss themselves, perhaps it can interrupt the chain of events before a mistake becomes a tragedy. It's an idea that is both incredibly logical and deeply controversial, because the moment we allow a machine to decide whether we are paying enough attention, we've crossed the line. The car is no longer just protecting us from the outside world, it's beginning to protect us from our own selves. And up until this point, the story seems fairly straightforward. Road accidents remain one of the leading causes of preventable deaths. Humans get distracted and they get tired and make mistakes. Artificial intelligence notices those mistakes before they become fatal, and that's how lives are saved and case closed, right? Except technology almost never solves a problem without creating new ones. History is full of inventions that made life dramatically better while quietly changing the way we behave. The calculator made mathematics easier, but many people gradually lost the ability to calculate in their heads. GPS made navigation effortless, but many of us can no longer find our way around places we've visited dozens of times without opening a map. Search engines gave us access to almost all human knowledge, and yet many psychologists argue that we've become less likely to remember information ourselves because we know that it can always be searched later. Every technological revolution extends one human ability, but it often weakens another. The question is whether driving monitoring AI follows the same pattern, because beneath all the engineering lies a much bigger conversation, and it's not about the cars, it's about the people. Let's start with the concern most people immediately think of: privacy. The moment people hear that a camera is watching the driver, one question naturally follows: am I being recorded? is a reasonable question. And after all, we've become accustomed to cameras collecting enormous amount of information. Our phones know where we travel, and websites know what we buy. Social media platforms know what we watch and what we click, and often how long we look at something before scrolling away. So when someone hears that there is now a camera pointed directly at their face every time they drive, it's understandable that alarm bells start ringing. The reality, however, is more nuanced because most driver monitoring systems are designed to process information locally inside the vehicle itself. In many cases, the system doesn't need to save video at all. Instead of storing footage, it converts the camera image into mathematical measurements like eye position and head angle and blink duration, and uses those measurements to decide whether to issue a warning. Once that decision has been made, the image itself may never be stored. From an engineering perspective, that's a sensible approach. You don't need a permanent video recording of someone's face to determine whether they've looked away from the road for 4 seconds. But this is where another question appears. Just because today's system don't store everything, does that mean tomorrow's won't? Technology rarely moves backwards. Every year, cars become more connected. Software updates arrive over the internet. Vehicles communicate with manufacturers. Some already upload diagnostic information automatically. Others continuously exchange traffic information with cloud services. So while the purpose of today's driver monitoring systems is road safety, many people wonder what happens if those capabilities expand. Could insurance companies one day request access to driver attention data? Could investigators examine it after a serious collision? Could employers monitor employees driving company vehicles? Could governments eventually require broader forms of monitoring? These aren't questions with simple answers. Some are already possible under specific legal circumstances. Others remain entirely hypothetical, but they are still worth asking because privacy debates rarely begin after a technology has become widespread. By then, most of the important decisions have already been made. And then there's another question, and it's one that I find even more interesting, which is responsibility. Imagine you're driving while exhausted and your car doesn't issue a warning. A few minutes later, you fall asleep and cause an accident. Who is responsible? I mean, the obvious answer is still the driver. The technology was never designed to replace personal judgment, but psychology has a habit of complicated simple answers. There is a concept known as automation bias, and it describes our tendency to trust automated systems, and sometimes more than we should. If the GPS says turn left, many people just turn left even if the road clearly looks wrong. If a spell checker says a word is correct, we rarely question it. If a calculator gives an answer, most of us accept it without performing the calculation ourselves. The more reliable technology becomes, the less likely we are to challenge it. Could the same thing happen in our cars? Imagine someone thinking, if I were really too tired to drive, surely the car would tell me. It's an innocent thought, but notice what just happened. The responsibility for judging one's own condition quietly shifted from the person to the machine. And it's not because the law demanded it or the manufacturer encouraged it, but that's how human beings naturally adapt to technology. We've seen this pattern before. Pilots rely heavily on autopilot systems. Doctors increasingly consult diagnostic software. Investors use algorithmic trading tools. And none of these technologies eliminate human responsibility, but they do change how responsibility is experienced. Instead of constantly asking, am I making the right decision? People begin asking, has the system warned me yet? That may seem like a subtle difference, but it isn't. It's a completely different relationship with the decision making, and that leads to dependence. One of the greatest strengths of modern technology is that it reduces effort. But effort isn't always the enemy. Sometimes effort is how we maintain our abilities. So imagine never having to remember phone numbers again. Convenient. Until you realize you've forgotten every number except your own. Imagine never having to navigate without GPS. Also convenient until your battery dies. Skills don't usually disappear overnight. They slowly fade when they are no longer needed. So it's worth asking whether constant technological assistance could gradually affect the way we monitor ourselves. Today, many experienced drivers instinctively notice when they are becoming tired. They recognize slower reactions and heavier eyelids, difficulty in concentrating, and some choose to pull over before the situation becomes dangerous. But what happens after 20 years of driving cars that constantly monitors those signals for you? Do people become better at recognizing fatigue or worse? We simply don't know yet, because this technology is still relatively new, and some of its biggest effects may have less to do with engineering than with psychology. Then there is the issue of trust. Ironically, these systems only work if drivers trust them. Too many false warnings and people become annoyed and start ignoring them. And too few warnings, people stop believing the system is useful. Finding that balance is remarkably difficult. Human behavior isn't perfectly predictable. Some people naturally move their heads more than others, and some wear sunglasses or have medical conditions. Some frequently check their mirrors, and some rarely move at all. The AI must somehow distinguish between thousands of different driving styles without becoming either overly sensitive or dangerously passive. And it's an engineering challenge, but it's also a human one, because trust is earned through experience and not through marketing. Finally, there is a question that extends far beyond cars. Perhaps the most important question of all. Every generation inherits new technology, and the automobile changed how we travel. The internet changed how we communicate. Smartphones change how we spend our attention. Artificial intelligence may change something even deeper, and that's how we relate to our own minds. For thousands of years, paying attention was entirely our responsibility. Knowing when we were too tired or too distracted, too emotional, or maybe too impaired, those were judgments we had to make ourselves. Now, for the first time, machines are beginning to participate in those judgments. And not because they are conscious or they are understanding us. It's just that they are becoming surprisingly good at recognizing patterns that even we sometimes miss. That doesn't automatically make this technology good, and it doesn't automatically make it bad either. It simply means we've entered a new chapter, one where the greatest challenge may not be teaching machines how to think, but making sure humans never stop thinking for themselves. So, where does all of this lead? It's tempting to think this conversation is only about cars, but it isn't. Cars just happen to be one of the first places where millions of people are beginning to experience a much larger transformation. Because what happened inside a car is happening almost everywhere else. Your phone already tries to predict what you will type before you finish your sentence. Your streaming service predicts what you will watch next. And your social media feed predicts what will keep you scrolling. Your smartwatch notices changes in your heartbeat before you do. Artificial intelligence isn't arriving all at once. It's quietly embedding itself into ordinary life. One decision at a time, one convenience at a time, one small improvement that seems too useful to refuse. And that's precisely why conversations like these matter. It's not because technology is evil or progress should be feared. History shows that technological progress has improved human life in countless ways. We live longer than previous generations. Cars are safer. Medicine is more effective. Communication is almost instantaneous. Millions of lives have been saved by inventions that once seemed frightening. Artificial intelligence almost certainly save lives too. In many ways, it already has. If a driver is about to fall asleep and the car wakes them up before they drift into oncoming traffic, that technology has done exactly what it was designed to do. If a camera notices a medical emergency before the driver realizes what's happening, that could mean the difference between life and death. And those benefits are real and they deserve to be acknowledged. But history teaches us something else. Technology doesn't only change what we can do, it changes what we no longer need to do ourselves. And that distinction may become one of the defining questions of the 21st century. Today is driver attention, but tomorrow it may be decision making, memory, communication, education, creativity. Perhaps one day artificial intelligence will take over hundreds of tiny mental tasks that we currently perform without thinking, and none of them will seem important on their own. And after all, using GPS once doesn't make you forget how to navigate, and using a calculator once doesn't erase your mathematical ability. So letting your car warn you once doesn't suddenly make you incapable of recognizing fatigue. Human behavior doesn't change overnight. It changes gradually, one habit at a time, one generation at a time, and that's what makes this conversation so fascinating. The greatest influence of artificial intelligence may not be what it does, it may be what it encourages to stop doing. The question isn't whether AI will become smarter, because it almost certainly will. The question is whether we continue developing ourselves at the same pace, because intelligence has never been just about solving problems. It's about recognizing them and questioning them and taking responsibility for them, knowing when we are wrong and knowing when we are tired, knowing when we should ask for help. Those are deeply human skills and they are worth protecting. So where should we go from here? Should we reject technologies like driver monitoring? I don't think that's the answer. If a system generally prevents accidents and saves lives, it deserves serious consideration. Refusing every new technology simply because it's unfamiliar has never been a good strategy. But accepting every new technology simply because it's possible isn't a good strategy either. Somewhere between fear and blind optimism lies something much more valuable, and that is curiosity. We should understand these systems before we celebrate them, before we fear them, before we depend on them. Because once a technology becomes part of everyday life, questioning it becomes much harder. As a society, perhaps we should encourage two things at the same time. Continue building smarter machines while never giving ourselves permission to become less thoughtful people. Teach artificial intelligence to recognize fatigue, but also teach children why sleep matters. Develop systems that reduce distracted driving, but ask why so many of us struggle to spend even a few minutes without reaching for our phones. Design technology that protects us without forgetting to build lives that require less protection in the first place. Because if we only solve the symptoms, we'll spend the rest of our lives inventing smarter and smarter machines compensate for increasingly distracted humans. Maybe the real goal isn't to create a world where AI constantly reminds us how to behave. Maybe it's to create a society where we need those reminders less often. The camera inside your car isn't really the story. A mirror reflecting a much bigger question, not about artificial intelligence, but about us, about what kind of people we are becoming, and whether in our pursuit of building machines that think a little more like humans, we are accidentally allowing humans to think a little less for themselves. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you made it this far,